where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
Everyone tells you that safety is found in staying small, in hiding from the world, in protecting your heart at all costs. But what if I told you that the very thing you're running from, the risk, the vulnerability, the terrifying possibility of being seen, is actually the only path to the life you're desperately craving? Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to admit. You can spend your entire existence playing it safe and still end up completely alone. Or you can risk everything for a chance at something real. Catherine thought she'd made her choice. She'd buried herself in silence, convinced that invisibility was better than judgment, that numbness was safer than feeling. Society had already decided who she was, the widow with scandalous secrets, the woman whispered about in drawing rooms, the outcast nobody dared approach. She'd accepted her sentence, built walls around her damaged heart, and resigned herself to a life of mere existence rather than truly living. But then came that winter ball, the one she almost didn't attend, the invitation she'd refused 3 times before, finally, reluctantly saying yes. And in one single moment, one penetrating gaze across a crowded ballroom, everything she thought she knew about safety, about protection, about keeping her distance from anything that could hurt her again, shattered completely. The Duke of Blackwood, the man everyone feared, the aristocrat shrouded in dark rumors and conspiracy theories, saw through every wall she'd constructed with nothing but a look. Not the polite, surface-level glance people give at social gatherings. No, this was something that reached into the deepest parts of her soul, exposing every hidden wound, every buried truth, every concealed piece of herself she'd sworn nobody would ever see again. And the most terrifying part? She couldn't look away. It was like being caught in a spell, trapped between the safety of her shadows and the dangerous pull of someone who understood her brokenness, because he carried his own. Here's what's going to shock you about this story. It's not really about a duke and a widow falling in love, though that happens. It's about something far more radical and uncomfortable. It's about the moment you stop letting other people's judgments write your story. It's about recognizing that the walls you built to protect yourself have actually become your prison. It's about understanding that the biggest risk isn't opening your heart again. It's wasting your entire life closed off from the very connections that make existence meaningful. Catherine's journey is a mirror for every single person who's been hurt, who's decided it's easier to hide than to be vulnerable, who's convinced themselves that being alone is a choice rather than a punishment they've accepted. The enigma at the heart of this tale isn't whether she'll find love. It's whether she'll find the courage to claim the life she actually deserves instead of the safe, small one she's settled for. What happened that night at the winter ball changed everything, not because some powerful duke noticed her, but because Catherine made a choice that went against every instinct for self-preservation screaming inside her. She chose to be seen. She chose to feel. She chose to risk the comfortable misery she knew for the terrifying possibility of something better. And that choice, that single moment of courage when fear tried to keep her hidden in her corner, but she extended her trembling hand anyway. That's the revelation we all need to hear. Because right now, you're probably standing at your own crossroads. Maybe it's not a winter ball or a mysterious duke, but you know that moment I'm talking about. And that choice, that single moment of courage when fear tried to keep her hidden in her corner, but she extended her trembling hand anyway, that's the revelation we all need to hear. Because right now, you're probably standing at your own crossroads. Maybe it's not a winter ball or a mysterious duke, but you know that moment I'm talking about. That decision between playing it safe and actually living. between protecting yourself from pain and opening yourself to joy, between existence and life. And here's the part that's going to make you uncomfortable. You already know what you need to do. You've known for a while. You're just waiting for permission, for a sign, for certainty that doesn't exist. Catherine's story is that permission. It's proof that the mystery of what happens when you choose courage over comfort is always, always worth exploring, even when, especially when, you're absolutely terrified of what you might discover about yourself along the way. You know what's funny about life-changing moments? They don't announce themselves with trumpets or grand signs. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary invitations you're tempted to refuse. Catherine had said no 3 times already, and honestly, who could blame her? After everything she'd been through, the thought of stepping into a ballroom filled with judging eyes and whispered secrets felt like walking into a lion's den. But Lady Margaret wasn't the type to take no for an answer. She'd shown up at Catherine's door that cold morning, determination written all over her face, and said something that would echo in Catherine's mind for weeks. You can't let rumors and cruel stares lock you away forever. You're still breathing, darling, and those who breathe must truly live. It's one of those statements that sounds simple but hits different when you're drowning in grief and shame, you know? Catherine sat in her dimly lit room that afternoon, staring at the invitation like it was some kind of enigma she couldn't solve. The paper felt heavy in her hands, heavier than it should have been. See, accepting meant more than just showing up to a party. It meant facing the world that had turned its back on her. It meant confronting the traces of her old life, the one where she was respected, where she belonged. Now she was just the widow everyone whispered about, the woman whose husband's sudden disappearance from society had left more questions than answers. People love a good mystery, don't they? Especially when it involves someone else's pain. They dissect your life like it's entertainment, creating their own codes of judgment that make no sense but somehow stick. Here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes you get so comfortable down there that climbing back up feels scarier than staying put. Catherine had spent months in that darkness, convinced that hiding was safer than facing potential rejection. But there's a difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself, and she was starting to realize she'd built her own cage. Lady Margaret's words kept playing on repeat. The living must live. How many times have you heard similar advice when going through something tough? Just get out there. Distract yourself. Time heals everything. And you roll your eyes because it sounds like empty platitudes from people who don't really get it. But sometimes, buried in those cliches, there's a truth you're not ready to hear yet. Sometimes the path forward starts with one uncomfortable step you don't feel ready to take. She spent her last savings fixing up an old navy blue dress she'd worn years ago, back when life was simpler. The seamstress gave her a pitying look that made Catherine's stomach turn, but she held her head high. There's something about choosing dignity when the world expects you to crumble, you know? The dress was simple, nothing compared to the expensive gowns other ladies would be wearing, but it was hers. When she looked at herself in the mirror the night of the ball, she barely recognized the reflection staring back. The woman she saw had tired eyes that had witnessed too much, shoulders that carried invisible weight, and a sadness that no amount of powder or rouge could hide. Every instinct screamed at her to take off the dress, send her apologies, and retreat back into her safe cocoon of silence. The conflict raging inside her was exhausting, but she went anyway. And that's the thing about courage that nobody tells you. It doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're terrified, but you do it anyway. Catherine's hands shook as she climbed into the carriage. Her heart pounded as they approached the manor. Every fiber of her being wanted to turn back, to run home where judgment couldn't reach her. But she didn't. She stepped out into the cold night air, smoothed down her dress, and walked toward the entrance. It's like when you're going through something difficult and everyone keeps pushing you to participate, to engage, to put yourself out there. You go without any real desire, just to stop hearing the same advice repeated. You show up physically, while emotionally you're still miles away, just going through the motions. Yet sometimes, it's precisely in those reluctant moments that life decides to surprise you. The thing about forbidden feelings is that they don't ask permission to arrive. Catherine wasn't looking for anything that night, except maybe to prove to herself and Lady Margaret that she could endure a few hours in society. She wasn't hunting for connection, romance, or validation. She'd actually convinced herself that chapter of her life was lost, gone forever, like smoke in the wind. But life has this peculiar sense of humor, doesn't it? It waits until you've completely given up on something before dropping it right in your lap. She walked through those doors with zero expectations, which is probably why what happened next caught her so completely off guard. The ballroom was already buzzing with activity, couples dancing, aristocrats gossiping, champagne flowing like water. And somewhere in that sea of silk and jewels, destiny was waiting. What Catherine didn't know as she found a quiet corner by a marble column, trying to make herself as invisible as possible, was that her decision to show up, despite every fear screaming at her to stay home, had already set everything in motion. The conspiracy of fate had already begun weaving its threads. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply appear when everything inside you is falling apart. It's showing up to life even when you feel like you have nothing left to offer. It's choosing to exist in spaces that feel uncomfortable, because staying hidden forever isn't really living. It's just surviving. And deep down, beneath all that grief and shame and exhaustion, Catherine still had a tiny spark that refused to die completely. That spark whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth showing up for. As she stood there watching the swirling dancers and glittering chandeliers, Catherine had no idea that across the room, someone else was about to arrive who was just as broken, just as isolated, just as desperate for something real in a world full of pretense. She didn't know that within hours, everything she thought she knew about herself, about safety, about protecting her heart, was about to be challenged. The hidden truth she'd been running from was about to step into the light. And when it did, there would be no going back to the comfortable numbness she'd wrapped around herself like armor. The story you think you're living can change completely in a single moment, with a single glance, from a single person who sees past all your carefully constructed walls. Catherine was about to discover that firsthand. The ballroom was absolutely packed, and Catherine felt swallowed by it all. Everywhere she looked, there were women dripping in jewels that probably cost more than her entire house, wearing gowns that screamed wealth and status. The men weren't any less impressive, discussing business deals between sips of expensive champagne, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. It was the kind of scene that would have excited her once upon a time, back when she belonged in these circles without question. But now? Now, she felt like an imposter, like someone who'd snuck in through the back door. She'd found herself a discreet little spot near a column, far enough from the main action that she could observe without being observed. Or at least, that's what she hoped. The secret she carried, the relief she'd felt at her husband's death, seemed to pulse beneath her skin like a brand everyone could see. From her hidden corner, Catherine watched the dancers glide across the floor, with a grace that seemed almost unreal. Their smiles came easy, their laughter genuine, their movements light as air, and she couldn't help but feel this sharp pang of envy cutting through her chest. But here's the thing. She wasn't envious of their money or their fancy dresses or their social standing. She was envious of something much simpler and infinitely more valuable. She envied their lightness, their ability to exist in a room without feeling like they were carrying boulders on their shoulders. She envied how they could smile without it feeling like their face might crack from the effort. You ever been in that headspace, where you're surrounded by people having a good time and you're just there, present but not really present, watching life happen around you like you're behind glass? That's when everything shifted. He walked in, and it wasn't loud or dramatic, but somehow everyone felt it. The Duke Blackwood didn't need an announcement or a trumpet fanfare. His presence just filled the room like a drop of ink spreading through water. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they changed. Voices lowered. Smiles became more calculated. People shifted their positions subtly, creating invisible barriers between themselves and him. It was fascinating to watch, really. Here was a man with more power and wealth than probably everyone in that room combined. And yet, he was treated like some kind of enigma people feared getting too close to. The traces of old rumors and whispered conspiracy theories followed him like shadows, making him untouchable in the worst possible way. Catherine found herself staring, and she wasn't alone. Half the room was watching him, but they were doing it carefully, pretending not to. You know how people do that thing where they're clearly looking at someone, but the moment that person glances their way, they suddenly find something else fascinating to look at? Yeah, that. But Catherine was far enough away and hidden enough that she could watch openly. And what she saw surprised her. The Duke was tall, imposing, dressed entirely in black like he was attending a funeral instead of a ball. Everything about him screamed power and control, from his broad shoulders to his firm jawline. But his eyes, God, those eyes told a completely different story. They weren't cold or cruel like she'd heard people say. They looked tired, almost lost, like someone who'd been searching for something they couldn't find and had finally given up looking. The contrast between his intimidating exterior and those weary eyes created this strange conflict that Catherine couldn't look away from. It's like seeing a fortress with cracks in its walls, you know? The structure looks impenetrable, but if you look close enough, you can see where it's barely holding together. And here's what really got her. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. In a ballroom packed with 300 people surrounded by noise and music and laughter, the Duke stood there as isolated as if he were on a deserted island. It was the loneliness that got her attention more than anything else. Not his reputation, not his title, not the silence that followed him wherever he moved. It was recognizing in someone else the same crushing isolation she felt every single day. Two people drowning in separate parts of the same ocean. She tried to pull her attention away, tried to focus on literally anything else. The orchestra playing a waltz, the couples spinning across the floor, the way the candlelight made the crystals on the chandelier sparkle like captured stars. But her eyes kept drifting back to him, almost against her will. It's like when you tell yourself not to think about something, and that makes it the only thing you can think about, right? The Duke moved through the crowd with this careful precision, acknowledging greetings with minimal nods, never stopping to actually engage. People parted for him like the Red Sea, and Catherine wondered if he noticed, if it bothered him, or if he'd grown so accustomed to being avoided that he didn't even register it anymore. The concealed pain behind his composed mask was something she recognized all too well because she wore a similar one. Have you ever felt surrounded by people but completely alone? Like you're in a crowded room but might as well be invisible? It's one of the most brutal forms of loneliness because it tricks you into thinking you're connected when you're really just occupying the same space as others without any real connection happening. Catherine knew that feeling intimately. She'd felt it at every social gathering since becoming a widow, felt it even in her own marriage before that, and watching the Duke navigate the ballroom with that same careful isolation, she realized something that made her chest tighten. They were the same. Two people standing in the same room, surrounded by hundreds of others, yet experiencing the exact same soul-crushing solitude. The revelation hit her harder than expected. Sometimes the most crowded places highlight loneliness more than empty ones ever could. And as she watched him scanning the room with those tired, searching eyes, she wondered if he felt it too. That horrible irony of being alone together in a sea of people. Little did she know, he'd already spotted her, and everything was about to change in ways neither of them saw coming. The mystery of what would unfold next was already taking shape, written in the space between their shared loneliness and the courage it would take to acknowledge it. Catherine really tried not to stare. She did. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself, especially not from him. She'd mastered the art of being invisible over the past year, perfected the skill of blending into walls and corners where nobody would notice her. But there's this weird thing about trying hard not to think about something, right? The more effort you put into avoiding it, the more it consumes your thoughts. She'd positioned herself to watch the dancers, told herself she was just observing the elegant waltz, appreciating the music, anything but focusing on the Duke. Yet every few seconds, her eyes would drift back to where he stood, that dark figure in a sea of pastels and gold. It was magnetic in a way she couldn't explain, this pull toward someone who represented everything she should be avoiding. The secret was that she wasn't just curious about him. She was drawn to the familiar pain she recognized in his posture. She was mid-thought, watching a couple stumble slightly through their steps, when it happened. That feeling. You know the one? That sudden chill that runs down your spine when you just know someone's watching you. It's primal, instinctive, impossible to ignore. The tiny hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her heart did this weird skip-beat thing. And even though every logical part of her brain said, "Don't look, just don't look," she couldn't help herself. She turned her head slowly, almost afraid of what she'd find. And then their eyes met. And God, it wasn't just a casual glance or a brief acknowledgement. His eyes were locked on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. It felt like he was looking through her skin, past her carefully constructed walls, straight into the parts of herself she kept hidden from everyone. The enigma of what he saw there terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. Time did that thing it does in movies, where everything slows down and gets weirdly quiet. The orchestra kept playing, people kept dancing, conversations kept flowing around them, but Catherine couldn't hear any of it. The entire ballroom faded into this blurry backdrop, like someone had taken an eraser to everything except him. It was just those eyes, dark, penetrating, impossibly focused, holding her captive from across the room. She should have looked away. Every rule of propriety, every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to break eye contact, to retreat back into her safe invisibility. But she couldn't. It was like being caught in a spell, frozen in place, while something invisible but incredibly powerful connected them across that crowded space. Have you ever locked eyes with someone and felt like they could see every trace of who you really are? It's absolutely terrifying. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Catherine's pulse pounded in her ears. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, started trembling. She became hyper-aware of everything. The way her dress suddenly felt too tight, how the room was too warm, the fact that she'd forgotten to breathe and needed to remember how. And through it all, he just kept looking at her with this expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't predatory exactly, wasn't threatening. It was more like recognition? Like he was seeing something in her that surprised him, something that made him unable to look away either. The silence between them was deafening despite all the noise surrounding them. It was the kind of moment that feels both impossibly intimate and completely forbidden, like they were sharing something they shouldn't be, acknowledging something that should stay hidden. Then the fear hit her. And it wasn't the fear she expected. She wasn't afraid he'd hurt her or embarrass her or expose her somehow. The fear was much more personal, much more dangerous. She was afraid of what he made her feel in those few seconds of eye contact. She was afraid because she'd spent months, no, years, building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she was better off alone, that feeling nothing was safer than risking feeling everything. She'd made promises to herself in the dark hours of night. Never again. Never let anyone in. Never give someone the power to affect you that deeply. And here was this stranger, this Duke with his dark reputation and isolated existence, demolishing those walls with nothing but a look. The conflict between her need for safety and this sudden, unwanted attraction was almost physically painful. You know when you've been hurt badly, and you decide that protecting yourself is the top priority? You build these massive walls, brick by brick, convincing yourself that being alone is better than being vulnerable. You tell yourself that you're fine, that you don't need connection, that independence is strength. Catherine had constructed a fortress around her heart that would have made medieval architects jealous. Every stone was a lesson learned, every battlement a reminder of past pain, every locked gate a promise to never let anyone close enough to wound her again. She'd become so good at it that she almost believed her own conspiracy, that she preferred solitude. But here's the brutal truth about walls. They're really good at keeping people out, but they're equally good at keeping you trapped inside. And in just a few seconds, one intense look from a stranger had created cracks in that fortress she could almost hear splintering. She broke first. Had to. The intensity was too much, too overwhelming, too everything. Catherine tore her gaze away and immediately felt like she could breathe again, like someone had released a hand from around her throat. Her heart was racing like she'd just run a mile. Her palms were actually sweating. When was the last time that happened? She felt flustered and confused, and angry at herself for feeling flustered and confused. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman, not some blushing debutante at her first ball. She'd been married, widowed, had survived society's judgment and her own guilt. One look from a man shouldn't reduce her to this trembling mess. But as she tried to calm her breathing, tried to convince her hands to stop shaking, she realized something that made everything worse. She wanted to look again. Despite the fear, despite the promises she'd made to herself, despite knowing it was probably the worst idea ever, she desperately wanted to meet his eyes again and feel that electric revelation one more time. Catherine decided she needed to leave, needed air, needed space away from those eyes and whatever spell they'd cast. She started to stand, already planning her escape route. Through the side door, grab her cloak, get into a carriage, and never look back. She'd tell Lady Margaret she'd tried, she'd shown up. That was enough. But as she began to rise from her chair, Smoothing down her dress and preparing to flee, she heard it. A voice. Deep, smooth, impossibly close. And every muscle in her body froze because she knew, even before looking, exactly who that voice belonged to. The mystery of how he'd crossed that entire ballroom without her noticing didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he was right there, close enough to touch, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The concealed connection they'd shared across the room was about to become very, very real, and Catherine had about 2 seconds to decide if she was brave enough to face it, or if she'd completely fall apart trying. "Lady Catherine!" Those 2 words, spoken in that deep, velvet voice, hit her like a physical force. She froze completely, half standing, half sitting, probably looking absolutely ridiculous. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that he knew her name. How did he know her name? They'd never been introduced, never spoken, never even been in the same room before tonight as far as she knew. Yet he said it with such certainty, such familiarity, like he'd been saying it for years. The secret of how he knew sent her mind spinning through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Had he asked about her? Had he been watching her longer than just tonight? The enigma of his knowledge made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her dress or her position in society. She turned slowly, so slowly, like her body was moving through honey. And there he was, standing close enough that the reality of him hit completely different than watching from across the room. He was tall, she'd known that, but up close it was almost overwhelming. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, those same intense eyes that had captured her moments ago. The scent of him reached her before anything else. Wood smoke, leather, something masculine and expensive and completely disorienting. It was the kind of scent that would stick in your memory, that you'd catch randomly weeks later and immediately be transported back to this moment. Her heart was doing acrobatics in her chest, and she desperately hoped he couldn't hear it. "Your Grace," she managed to whisper, dropping into a curtsy that felt clumsy and awkward compared to the graceful movements of other ladies. Her legs were literally shaking, and she prayed she wouldn't actually fall over and complete her humiliation. "You've been hiding in this corner for an hour. Didn't you come to dance?" His voice wasn't what she expected at all. Everyone talked about the Duke like he was made of ice, cold and unfeeling, someone who'd freeze you with a single word. But his voice had this softness to it, almost gentle, like velvet wrapped around steel. There was something else, too. Something she couldn't quite identify at first. Then it hit her. Loneliness. She could hear it buried beneath the cultured accent and proper words, this deep well of isolation that mirrored her own. It was the voice of someone who'd forgotten what real connection felt like, someone going through the motions of social interaction while being fundamentally disconnected from it all. The trace of pain in his tone made her chest tighten because she recognized it so intimately. They were speaking the same language of loss, even if neither had said anything real yet. "I don't dance anymore, Your Grace." The words came out quieter than she intended, almost like a confession. Because it was true, wasn't it? She hadn't danced in over a year. Not because she physically couldn't, but because no one had asked. It was like she'd become invisible the moment her husband died, or worse, visible in all the wrong ways. People stared, whispered, judged, but nobody actually approached her. Nobody invited her to dance or engaged her in real conversation. She'd become this concealed figure that everyone talked about, but nobody talked to. It was the loneliest kind of visibility, being seen but not acknowledged, being the subject of gossip but never of genuine interest. And she'd told herself it was fine, that she preferred it that way, that dancing was frivolous anyway. But standing here, admitting it out loud, she realized how much it had actually hurt to be overlooked night after night. By choice or by lack of invitation? His question cut straight through her carefully constructed excuses. God, how did he do that? How did he see through her defenses so easily when she'd spent months perfecting them? The truth was uncomfortable. Both. Yes, she'd told herself she didn't want to dance, but that had only come after realizing nobody would ask anyway. It's easier to say you don't want something than to admit nobody's offering it to you, right? It's a protective mechanism, convincing yourself you chose isolation rather than having it forced upon you. But his question stripped away that comfortable lie and made her confront reality. She'd been rejected by society, treated like she carried some contagious disease. Widowhood had become her defining characteristic, overshadowing everything else she was or had been. The conspiracy of whispers had turned her into an outcast, and she'd accepted it because fighting felt too exhausting. Both, I believe. Her honesty surprised her. She wasn't someone who opened up easily, especially not to intimidating dukes who'd appeared out of nowhere. But something about him pulled truth from her like gravity. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, really looked, not through her or past her, but directly at her like she was worth seeing. Maybe it was recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood isolation from the inside out. Whatever it was, she felt safer being honest with this stranger than she'd felt being superficial with people she'd known for years. Then he did something that stopped her heart completely. He extended his hand. That strong, elegant hand with long fingers that looked like they could crush or caress with equal ease. Just held it out between them like an offering, a question, an invitation to something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but desperately wanted anyway. Then permit me to correct that injustice. His words were formal, proper, exactly what you'd expect from a duke asking a lady to dance. But his eyes told a different story entirely. They held this intensity, this raw honesty that said this wasn't just about a dance. This was about acknowledgement, about seeing each other, about two isolated people choosing connection over safety. Catherine stared at that extended hand like it was a snake ready to strike. Or maybe more accurately, like it was a bridge over a chasm she wasn't sure she could cross. Because accepting meant so much more than just dancing. It meant being seen by everyone in that ballroom. It meant stepping out of her comfortable corner of invisibility and into the harsh spotlight of society's judgment. It meant risking her heart, her pride, her carefully maintained emotional distance. The conflict raging inside her was almost unbearable. Stay safe and stay alone, or risk everything for a chance at feeling alive again. Here's something they don't tell you about pivotal moments in life. They never arrive when you're ready. They don't wait until you've got your confidence back, until you've healed completely, until you feel strong enough to handle whatever comes next. They show up when you're still scared, still broken, still convinced you're not enough. They force you to choose between the comfortable numbness of protection and the terrifying vulnerability of actually living. Catherine had spent a year hiding, and she could keep hiding for 10 more years if she wanted. Nobody would force her out of her corner. But she'd also remain exactly where she was. Stuck, stagnant, existing, but not truly alive. The forbidden desire to feel something real again warred with her fear of getting hurt. And in that moment, with his hand extended, and those dark eyes looking at her with something that felt dangerously close to understanding, she had to decide. Would she let fear write the rest of her story? Or would she take control of the pen herself? Her hand, trembling visibly, reached out. Her fingers touched his, and in that simple contact, electricity shot through her entire body as she placed her trembling hand in his steady one, sealing a choice that would change everything. The mystery of what she'd just agreed to hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure, and there was absolutely no turning back now. The moment they stepped onto the dance floor, Catherine felt every single eye in that ballroom turn toward them. It wasn't her imagination or paranoia. They were actually staring, all of them. The whispers started immediately, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. She could practically hear the scandal brewing. The Ice Duke is dancing with the Hargrave widow. Can you believe it? The weight of their judgment pressed down on her shoulders, making each step feel heavier than it should. This was exactly what she'd feared, exactly why she'd hidden in that corner all night. Being invisible was lonely, sure, but being the center of malicious gossip? That was a different kind of torture entirely. The secret everyone thought they knew about her felt like it was written across her forehead in bold letters for all to see. Every whispered word, every pointed look, every barely concealed smirk from the other ladies made her want to pull her hand from his and run straight out of there. But then his hand settled on her waist, firm and steady, grounding her in a way she didn't expect. His other hand held hers with surprising gentleness, like she was something precious rather than scandalous. And they began to move, falling into the rhythm of the waltz as naturally as breathing. "Ignore them," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They're not worth your concern." It sounded so easy when he said it like that, so simple. Just ignore 300 people staring at you like you're some kind of circus act. Just pretend you don't hear the silence that falls when you pass by, followed immediately by excited whispers. Just act like their judgment doesn't slice into you like tiny knives. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Easy for your grace to say," she replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "You don't live on their approval." The trace of bitterness in her tone surprised even her. A smile flickered across his lips. Not quite a full smile, more like the ghost of one. The memory of what smiling used to feel like. It transformed his face completely, softening the harsh lines and making him look younger, less burdened. "You think I don't know what it's like to be judged?" he asked, and there was something almost amused in his tone, but dark too, like he was laughing at a joke only he understood. "You think I don't hear what they say about me? The Ice Duke, the man without a heart, the recluse who probably murders people in his spare time." He spun her gently, and she had to admit he was an incredible dancer, leading with confidence that made it easy to follow even though her mind was spinning. "I've been the subject of their conspiracy theories for years, Lady Catherine. I could write a book about all the creative stories they've invented about me." His words should have been bitter, angry even, but instead they sounded tired, resigned to a reality he couldn't change. Catherine looked up at him then, really looked, studying his face the way he'd studied hers earlier. And what she saw shocked her. Behind the intimidating exterior, behind the cold reputation and the commanding presence, she saw pain. Deep, aching, exhausting pain. She saw loneliness that had carved itself into the lines around his eyes. She saw someone who'd been carrying a burden so heavy for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. The enigma of the Ice Duke suddenly made sense. He wasn't cold by nature. He was exhausted by circumstance. He'd built walls just like she had, worn masks just like she did, pretended to be fine while slowly drowning inside. The recognition was almost overwhelming. They were the same, just wearing different versions of the same armor. "Why did you ask me to dance?" The question escaped before she could stop it, more vulnerable than she'd intended. She needed to understand what this was, what he wanted, why he'd singled her out. "Because I saw in your eyes the same thing I see in mine when I look in the mirror." His answer was immediate, honest, devastating in its simplicity. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Nobody had acknowledged the concealed pain she thought she was hiding so well. People either ignored her suffering or they reveled in it, using it as entertainment or cautionary tale. But he'd seen it, recognized it, and rather than looking away like everyone else, he'd walked straight toward it. "And what do you see?" she whispered, almost afraid of the answer, but needing to hear it anyway. The music swirled around them. Other couples danced nearby. The world continued spinning. But in that moment, it felt like they existed in their own private bubble where only truth was allowed. The forbidden intimacy of the moment made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. Someone tired of pretending they're okay. Someone exhausted from being alone in a world full of people. His words landed like punches, each one hitting exactly where she was most tender. God, how did he know? How could he articulate what she'd barely been able to admit to herself? It's one thing to feel something privately, to experience it in the quiet darkness of your own mind. It's entirely different to have someone else name it, to hear your secret pain spoken aloud in someone else's voice. It strips away all your defenses, all your carefully maintained denial. You can lie to yourself about how you're doing, convince yourself you're managing just fine. But when someone else sees through the facade, that's when you have to face reality. And Catherine's reality was exactly what he'd described. She was exhausted. Exhausted from faking smiles, from pretending grief was her only emotion when really it was relief mixed with guilt. Exhausted from being surrounded by people who looked at her but never truly saw her. This scene gets me every single time, you know? Because how often are we exactly in this position? Walking around with our game faces on, telling everyone, "I'm fine," when inside we're completely falling apart? Smiling on the outside while screaming on the inside? We've become so good at performing wellness, at convincing others we've got it together, that we start believing our own performance. We wear our masks so long they start feeling like our actual faces. But here's what's beautiful and terrifying about what was happening between Catherine and the Duke. They were removing their masks. Right there on a crowded dance floor, surrounded by judgment and whispers, they were choosing to be real with each other. Not perfect, not put together, not fine, just honest. Just two damaged people acknowledging that, yeah, we're struggling. And maybe that's okay, because at least we're not struggling alone anymore. The music continued its lilting melody, and their steps stayed synchronized, moving together like they'd been dancing partners for years instead of minutes. But something was happening between them that went far deeper than physical movement. Their souls were doing their own dance, circling each other cautiously, testing boundaries, seeing if this connection was real or just wishful thinking born from mutual loneliness. With each turn, each step, each moment their eyes met and held, the walls they'd both built were crumbling a little more. Not completely. That would take time, trust, a million other moments of choosing vulnerability over safety. But the foundation was cracking, and light was starting to seep through those cracks. The revelation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, but absolutely undeniable. Two people who'd been convinced they'd remain alone forever had just found each other. And while neither knew what that meant yet, while both were probably terrified of what happened next. In that moment, dancing under chandeliers while society watched and whispered, they both felt something they'd forgotten was possible: hope. The mystery of where this fragile connection would lead hung between them like a promise, dangerous and delicate and absolutely worth exploring, even if it meant risking everything they'd built to protect themselves from exactly this kind of feeling. After the dance ended, Catherine needed to get out of there. Not because dancing with him had been terrible, quite the opposite, actually, and that was precisely the problem. He'd made her feel too much, awakened things inside her she'd worked hard to bury, and it was overwhelming in a way that made her chest tight and her thoughts chaotic. She mumbled some excuse about needing air and headed straight for the garden doors before he could respond or anyone could intercept her. The cold hit her immediately as she stepped outside, winter air sharp enough to steal her breath. Snow was starting to fall, tiny flakes drifting down like frozen tears, and the contrast between the suffocating warmth of the ballroom and this biting cold felt almost cleansing. She wrapped her arms around herself, not sure if she was shaking from temperature or emotion. Probably both. The secret was that the cold outside felt better than the heat inside, because at least out here, her physical discomfort matched her internal chaos. She thought she'd have a moment alone to collect herself, to rebuild the walls that his words and touch had damaged, to remember all the reasons why letting anyone in was a terrible idea. But then his voice came from behind her, and honestly, she should have expected it. "Running from me?" There was something almost playful in his tone, if the ice duke could be playful, which seemed impossible based on his reputation. Catherine kept her eyes fixed on the snow-covered garden, on the skeletal trees and frozen fountain. Anywhere but him. "Running from myself," she admitted quietly, because apparently being honest with this man was becoming a habit she couldn't break. It felt safer to tell him the truth than to construct the elaborate lies she fed everyone else. The silence stretched between them for a moment, comfortable rather than awkward, like two people who understood that sometimes quiet speaks louder than words. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence but not touching, respecting her space while making his support clear. They stood there together, watching the snow fall in that particular quiet that only winter brings, when the world feels muffled and distant. Then he spoke, and what he said knocked the breath from her lungs more effectively than the cold ever could. "My brother died in the war. I was beside him when it happened." His voice was steady, controlled, but she could hear the underlying tremor of old pain that never quite healed. "I promised I'd take care of his family, but I failed. His wife died of grief within months. The children were taken by distant relatives who wanted the inheritance more than the kids. And I became this." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the reputation he carried like chains. Someone people prefer to avoid. The trace of guilt in his confession was so raw, it hurt to hear. Catherine's heart clenched painfully. She turned to face him, seeing his profile illuminated by the light spilling from the ballroom windows, sharp angles and shadows that made him look like a tragic sculpture. "You're carrying guilt that isn't yours," she said softly. And wasn't that ironic? She could see his unfair burden so clearly while being blind to her own. But that's how it works, isn't it? We're excellent at identifying other people's irrational guilt while clinging desperately to our own. We can be wise counselors for everyone else's problems while remaining complete messes in our own lives. He turned his head to look at her then, really look at her, and the intensity in those dark eyes made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What guilt are you carrying, Lady Catherine?" The question hung in the freezing air between them, and she knew this was a crossroads. She could deflect, change the subject, retreat back behind her walls. Or she could do something terrifying and liberating. Tell the truth. The words came tumbling out before her fear could stop them. "I didn't love my husband. We married for convenience, for practical reasons that had nothing to do with affection. When he died, I felt relief, and I hate myself for it." Saying it out loud felt like ripping open a wound she'd been trying to let scab over, but also like lancing a poison that had been festering inside her for too long. This was the concealed truth she'd never admitted to anyone, barely admitted to herself in the darkest hours of night when she couldn't sleep. The shame of it had been eating her alive, making her believe she was fundamentally broken, irredeemably terrible. Society expected widows to be devastated, to mourn properly, to demonstrate appropriate grief. But how do you mourn someone you never loved? How do you grieve a loss that feels more like liberation? The conflict between what she was supposed to feel and what she actually felt had been tearing her apart for months. "Not loving someone doesn't make you a bad person," he said with such gentle certainty that tears suddenly burned behind her eyes. "It makes you honest." Those simple words cracked something open inside her chest, like he'd found the exact key to a lock she'd thought was permanently sealed. Nobody had ever given her permission to feel what she actually felt, to acknowledge that her relief was valid, that not performing grief didn't make her a monster. Everyone had expected her to play a role: the devastated widow, the woman who'd lost her great love, the tragic figure deserving of pity. But the reality was so much more complicated, so much messier than that neat narrative. And here was this man, this supposed ice duke with no heart, offering her more compassion and understanding than anyone else had in the entire past year. The conspiracy about him was all wrong. He wasn't cold. He was just careful about who he let see his warmth. "Society doesn't see it that way," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "They think I'm cold, unfeeling. They whisper that I probably killed him myself." She laughed bitterly because the rumors were so absurd, they'd be funny if they weren't so hurtful. "Society is hypocritical," he replied, and there was steel in his voice now, anger on her behalf that touched her more than she wanted to admit. "Everyone pretends. Everyone lies. Everyone wears masks and plays their assigned parts. But beneath all that performance, we're all just trying to survive our own storms, making mistakes, carrying regrets, doing our best with the cards we've been dealt." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "The difference between us and them is that we're willing to acknowledge the truth, at least to each other. That takes more courage than any of their perfect pretense." The mystery of how he understood her so perfectly, so quickly, was almost unsettling. And in that moment, everything shifted. The masks fell away completely. The defenses crumbled. The pretense ended. They stood there in the freezing garden, snow falling around them like the world was being cleansed. And they saw each other, truly saw each other, for exactly what they were: human, flawed, damaged, imperfect, but real. So devastatingly, beautifully real in a world full of fakery. Catherine felt lighter than she had in years, like confessing her truth had lifted a weight she hadn't realized was crushing her. And looking at the Duke, seeing the understanding and acceptance in his eyes rather than judgment or horror, she realized something that was both wonderful and terrifying. This connection they'd stumbled into wasn't just about shared loneliness or mutual understanding. It was about being seen, really, truly seen, and accepted anyway. Maybe even because of the brokenness rather than despite it. The forbidden intimacy of standing in the cold, sharing secrets that could destroy reputations, trusting each other with truths they'd kept hidden from everyone else. It bound them together in a way that felt unbreakable. The snow continued falling, covering the garden in white, and Catherine wondered if this was what redemption felt like. Not perfect, not easy, not without risk, but possible. For the first time in forever, healing felt possible. And as they stood there in comfortable silence, two broken people finding unexpected solace in each other, she realized the revelation she'd been avoiding for months. Maybe being broken wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was just the beginning of something entirely new, something she never could have found if she'd stayed safely hidden in her corner, refusing to risk her heart. The question now was whether she'd be brave enough to see where this led, or if fear would win after all. The days following the ball were absolute torture for Catherine. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about their conversation in the garden, about the way he'd looked at her like she was worth seeing. It invaded her thoughts when she was supposed to be reading, distracted her during meals, kept her awake at night staring at the ceiling. And then the gifts started arriving. First, flowers, not the typical roses everyone sent, but winter jasmine, delicate and unexpected, and somehow perfect. Then a book, specifically a poetry collection she'd mentioned loving in passing during their dance. How had he remembered that tiny detail? And finally, the thing that really threw her, an invitation to take tea at his estate. Just sitting there on expensive paper with his seal pressed into dark wax, innocent-looking, but carrying the weight of 1,000 implications. The secret whisper in the back of her mind said this was dangerous, that accepting meant crossing a line she couldn't uncross, but another part of her desperately wanted to see what lay on the other side of that line. Catherine spent hours staring at that invitation, reading it so many times she had it memorized. 3 o'clock on Thursday. Simple tea. Nothing scandalous about it on the surface, right? Except everything about it was scandalous. A widow having private tea with an unmarried duke? Society would have a field day. The whispers would multiply. The judgments would intensify. And whatever shreds of reputation she still possessed would be completely shredded. She'd be confirming every terrible thing they already believed about her, giving them ammunition they'd use for years. But here's the thing that kept circling through her mind. Wasn't her reputation already destroyed? Hadn't they already decided who she was, what she'd done, how they'd treat her? Maybe Lady Margaret was right when she'd said Catherine couldn't hide forever, couldn't let other people's opinions imprison her in her own home. The enigma was whether stepping into the light would free her or just expose her to more pain. Lady Margaret, bless her, was characteristically direct when Catherine finally worked up the courage to ask her opinion. She came over for morning tea, took one look at Catherine's face and the invitation sitting on the table between them, and didn't mince words. "Catherine, you have a choice to make, and nobody can make it for you." She stirred sugar into her tea with precise movements, letting the silence build before continuing. "You can spend the rest of your life afraid. You can let what happened, let what people think, let your own fear keep you locked up safe where nothing can hurt you. That's completely valid. Nobody would blame you." She paused, meeting Catherine's eyes with that penetrating look she had. "Or you can choose to actually live. But here's the part nobody wants to hear. You cannot have both. You cannot stay safe and change your life at the same time. Those two things are fundamentally incompatible." The trace of old pain in Margaret's eyes suggested she was speaking from personal experience, from her own battles with fear and choice. And isn't that the brutal truth none of us want to face? We talk about wanting change, about wanting different lives, better relationships, new experiences, but we also want to stay comfortable, to avoid risk, to guarantee we won't get hurt. We want transformation without the terror that comes with it. We want growth without the painful stretching. We want connection without vulnerability. But life doesn't work that way, does it? Real change always requires stepping into uncertainty. It demands that you leave behind what's familiar, even if what's familiar is making you miserable, because at least miserable is predictable. At least you know what to expect. Accepting the Duke's invitation meant Catherine was saying yes to so much more than tea. She was saying yes to possibility, to feeling again, to opening herself up to potential heartbreak. But she was also saying yes to potentially being happy again, to experiencing genuine connection, to feeling alive rather than just existing. The conflict was tearing her apart because both options came with their own kind of pain. If she said no, she'd stay exactly where she was. Safe, sure, but also stagnant. She'd wake up every day for the next 20 or 30 years, repeating the same routine, feeling the same numbness, experiencing the same isolation. She'd watch life happen to other people while she observed from her comfortable prison of self-protection. And one day she'd be old, looking back on her life, wondering what might have happened if she'd just been brave enough to say yes. That's a special kind of hell, isn't it? Living with the ghost of possibilities you were too afraid to explore. But if she said yes, well, that came with its own terrifying unknowns. What if he hurt her? What if this was some elaborate game and she was the punchline? What if she opened her heart and he crushed it? What if she was wrong about him, about the connection she thought they'd shared? The conspiracy theorist in her head had a million scenarios, each worse than the last. But there was another possibility, quieter but more powerful than the fear. What if she said yes, and it was wonderful? What if this man who saw through her walls, who shared her pain, who understood her guilt without judgment, what if he was exactly what her lonely, damaged heart had been searching for? What if saying yes led to healing she couldn't even imagine right now? What if the risk was worth it? Catherine sat alone in her drawing room that evening, watching shadows lengthen across the walls as the sun set. The invitation sat in front of her, demanding an answer. She thought about the past year, about the isolation and judgment and grief that wasn't really grief. She thought about standing in that garden, sharing truths she'd never told anyone, feeling seen for the first time in forever. She thought about his eyes, the way he'd held her while they danced, the gentleness in his voice when he'd told her that not loving her husband didn't make her a monster. The concealed truth was that she'd already made her decision the moment their eyes first met across that ballroom. She just hadn't admitted it to herself yet. What's the alternative, really? She could play it safe, protect herself, avoid any chance of getting hurt. But protection from pain also means protection from joy, from love, from all the things that make life worth living. You can't selectively numb yourself. If you close off the bad, you close off the good too. And Catherine had been numb for so long, she'd almost forgotten what feeling anything real was like. Until him. Until that night. Until she'd remembered that underneath all the grief and guilt and shame, she was still alive, still capable of connection, still worthy of being seen and accepted. The forbidden hope growing in her chest was dangerous, absolutely. But it was also intoxicating. It whispered that maybe her story wasn't over, that maybe the worst chapter had passed, and something better was waiting if she was just brave enough to turn the page. So she did what terrified her most. She made a choice that prioritized her potential happiness over her guaranteed safety. Catherine walked to her writing desk, pulled out paper and pen, and began to write. Her hand trembled slightly, making the letters less elegant than usual. But she didn't care. "Your Grace, I accept your invitation." 7 words. That's all it took to change the trajectory of her entire life. 7 words to say yes to risk, yes to possibility, yes to herself and what she deserved. She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself, before fear could convince her to tear it up and write a polite refusal instead. The revelation was simple, but profound. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to move forward despite being absolutely terrified. And as she handed the letter to her servant to deliver, Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. Not certainty, not confidence that everything would work out perfectly, but hope. Fragile, tentative, barely there hope that maybe, just maybe, she was making the right choice. That maybe risking her heart again wouldn't destroy her. That maybe this time vulnerability would lead to connection rather than pain. The mystery of what would happen next was completely unknown, and for once, that felt more exciting than terrifying. She'd spent so long trying to control outcomes, trying to protect herself from every possible hurt. But some things in life can't be controlled or predicted. Some things require a leap of faith into darkness, trusting that either you'll fly or someone will catch you. Catherine had just taken that leap, and there was absolutely no going back now. So here's the question you need to ask yourself right now, and I want you to be brutally honest. How long are you going to let fear decide your story? How many more days are you going to wake up, go through the motions, pretend you're fine, and go to bed knowing deep down that you're just existing, not living? Catherine stood exactly where you're standing right now, at that terrifying crossroads between safety and possibility, between the comfortable prison of protection and the risky freedom of vulnerability. She could see both paths clearly. One kept her exactly where she was, numb but safe, isolated but unharmed. The other? That path was completely unknown, filled with potential heartbreak but also potential joy, possible pain but also possible connection. And she had to choose, just like you have to choose right now. Because here's the secret nobody tells you. Not choosing is still a choice. Staying where you are, letting another day pass without taking that risk, convincing yourself you'll be brave tomorrow. That's choosing fear. That's choosing the slow death of never knowing what could have been. Think about Catherine's journey for a second. She went from hiding in corners, carrying guilt that wasn't hers, living under the weight of society's judgment, to standing in a winter garden confessing her deepest truths to someone who actually saw her. She went from believing she was fundamentally broken and unworthy of connection to realizing that her brokenness didn't disqualify her from love. It actually made her more real, more human, more capable of genuine connection than all those perfect people pretending behind their masks. That transformation didn't happen because some magical duke appeared and fixed her. It happened because she made a series of terrifying choices. To show up when she wanted to hide, to stay when she wanted to run, to be honest when lying was easier, to risk her heart when protection felt safer. Every single moment she chose courage over comfort. She reclaimed a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. And that's exactly what's available to you right now, in your own life, with your own fears and your own crossroads. What trace of yourself have you lost to fear? What parts of who you really are have you buried because showing them felt too dangerous, too vulnerable, too risky? Maybe you've convinced yourself that you're naturally introverted, when really you're just protecting yourself from rejection. Maybe you've decided you don't need close relationships, when the truth is you're terrified of being hurt again. They're preventing the very things you actually want from reaching you. And every day you spend reinforcing those walls is another day you're choosing fear over the possibility of something better. Here's what I need you to understand. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't need to be completely healed, totally confident, absolutely certain before you take that first step. Catherine wasn't ready. She was terrified, shaking, convinced she'd probably get hurt again. But she did it anyway because she realized that waiting until you feel ready means waiting forever. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite being absolutely terrified. It's extending your trembling hand even when every instinct screams to pull back. It's saying yes when your entire history of pain says no. It's choosing to believe that you're worthy of connection, of love, of being truly seen, even when all the evidence of your past wounds suggests otherwise. The revelation Catherine discovered, and the one waiting for you, is that on the other side of that terrifying vulnerability is everything you've been missing. Not perfection, not guaranteed happiness, not a fairy tale ending, but something infinitely more valuable, the chance to actually live instead of just exist. So what are you going to do? Are you going to close this video, nod along like it was interesting but ultimately not applicable to your situation, and go right back to the comfortable patterns that are slowly suffocating you? Or are you going to take one brave step today toward the life you actually want? Maybe it's reaching out to someone you've been avoiding. Maybe it's having that honest conversation you've been postponing. Maybe it's accepting an invitation that terrifies you, or admitting a truth you've been hiding, or simply acknowledging that you're not as okay as you pretend to be. Whatever your version of Catherine's winter ball is, whatever your moment of choice looks like, do it. Choose courage. Choose vulnerability. Choose the mystery of what might happen over the certainty of staying stuck. Because I promise you, the regret of not trying is infinitely worse than the temporary pain of risking and possibly failing. The conflict you're experiencing right now between wanting to change and being afraid to change, that tension you feel, that's actually a good sign. It means you're at the edge of transformation, standing at the border between who you've been and who you could become. Don't waste this moment. Catherine's story isn't just entertainment. It's a mirror showing you what's possible when you stop letting fear write your story and start choosing courage instead. Her journey from isolated widow to woman brave enough to risk her heart again is available to you too. Not the specific details, not the Duke and the ball and the dramatic romance, but the essence of it. The decision to stop hiding, to be seen, to trust that you're worthy of the connection and joy and genuine life you're craving. That choice is sitting in front of you right now, just like that invitation sat in front of Catherine. The question is, will you have the courage to say yes? If this story resonated with you, if something in Catherine's journey felt familiar or inspiring or challenging, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because we're just getting started exploring these themes of courage, vulnerability, transformation, and what it really takes to build a life worth living. There are more stories coming, more uncomfortable truths to explore, more forbidden topics that nobody wants to talk about, but everyone needs to hear. Don't let this be just another video you watched and forgot. Let it be the moment you decided things were going to be different. Let Catherine's choice inspire your own. And then, come back and tell me in the comments what brave step you took, what risk you chose, what scary thing you did despite your fear. I want to hear your story. We all need to hear it. Because the more we share our journeys from fear to courage, from hiding to being seen, from existing to truly living, the more permission we give each other to do the same. So subscribe, stay connected, and let's keep learning together about what it means to choose life over safety, connection over protection, and courage over comfort. Your story isn't over yet. In fact, it might just be beginning. Don't miss what happens next.